Okay, so we're just about ready to begin with thinking about the Parsha, which is Shmini, the eighth day. It talks about the day of the following the inauguration of the temple. So the temple has 7-day inauguration period. And then on the eighth day, we read that the divine presence rests in the temple. And that's the culmination of really the second half of the book of Exodus and the beginning of the book of Leviticus. And we're working toward this amazing time where the Jewish people could sense the divine presence in the temple. And that's sort of the opening episode. And then you get to the story of the tragic story, which we mentioned on Tuesday, which is the death of the sons of Aaron. And after that, we have matters of sort of the aftermath of that event. So you have the story where Aaron, in a way, is in mourning, but in a way, God says he cannot be in mourning. In other words, he has to continue. Aaron represents the community. So if he represents the community, it's a joyous day for the community. His personal mourning is not supposed to interfere with the collective joy. So ironically, it says that the cousins, the Levites, the cousins went and they took care of the Aaron's two sons who passed, and Aaron himself is supposed to continue in the festivities of the day, and because a high priest in mourning is not allowed to eat the flesh of the offerings, but this was an exception. Long story short, there's this dispute between Moses and Aaron about what to do with specific offerings, whether or not they could be consumed or they have to be burnt. And Moshe is upset at Aaron because Aaron burns it, and he says he should have eaten it. And they have this little exchange, and finally, Moshe agrees with Aaron. That relates to what we're talking a lot about on Sundays about the difference in leadership between Moses and Aaron. So that's another subject. And at the end, we talk about the laws of kosher food and animals. And the Torah refers to it sometimes as pure animals. Kosher animals are pure animals. And then from there, we talk about some of the laws of purity, which is the laws of mikvah. So there's a lot of moving parts. And the question is there an overarching idea? And what is the overarching idea? And how does the overarching idea play out in the various specific stories of the parsha? And which piece to emphasize, which text to read. So there's a lot of moving parts, but I think we should start with the big picture and then show sort of how the big picture will play out in different areas of the parsha. So as we began discussing on Tuesday, you have the concept of 8. And 8 is the earlier Kabbalists, even before the Hasidic movement, are pointing out that the number 8 represents beyond nature, the transcendent light. You have the symbol for infinity in mathematics. Ben was kind enough to send it to me. I think it was 1600s. That was the first time it was used as a symbol. And that's sort of infinity. So 8 comes from infinity. Where do you get why is 8 related to infinity? If 7 is the natural world, because the cycle of the week, 8 is that which transcends. So we also talked about, I'll call it the paradox of 8, because in a way, Judaism is about the paradox of how to connect the infinite with the finite, how to connect the transcendent and the immanent, how to connect the heaven and earth. In other words, in a way, it's actually easy to think about transcendence. We talked about this last time also. We talked about the creatures of the sea. It's very easy to be in the sea. It's easy, I'm not saying very easy. It's relatively speaking, it's easy to lose yourself in something greater. It's much harder to walk both, to be on the dry land and walk, have the attitude of the sea creature on the dry land. So the place of meeting where these two energies connect, the transcendent and the practical, that is what's difficult. That is the space, that's the ground zero. That's where the interesting things happen. And in some ways, that's the theme of the entire parsha, because what are we saying? What happens on the eighth day? The divine presence dwells on earth. What happens on the eighth day? There's a home for God in the physical space. The infinite God is expressed in the temple. So that like I said, in a way it's a paradox, in a way it's absurd, but that's the idea of eight. And what we're trying to get at is what does that look like? And what are the challenges to the space of being in the space of eight? And I mentioned this also on Tuesday, but eight is interesting because on one hand, it's the transcendent number. On the other hand, it follows seven. So you even just by calling it eight, you are saying that it's related to the seven because eight follows seven. You can't have eight without having the seven. So if you want to have God is one is also transcendent because you say God is one. What does that mean? That means that it includes God is transcendent from all the multiplicity of creation, and all the multiplicity of creation is sort of swallowed up in the oneness of God. So that's also an expression of transcendence. But when you say eight, you're saying something else. When you say eight, you're saying that the seven and the eight are related, that the natural and the supernatural are related, that the finite and the infinite are related. And this is tricky, and it's paradoxical, and it's difficult. And we want to talk about maybe we'll start with two different expressions, how this idea expresses itself in the parsha. And well, I guess the parsha, maybe we'll do a little of the Haftorah, and then we'll see where we go. So we're still in a state of, it's still in formation. The ideas are still in formation. You can take it any way you want. So if anyone has any questions and wants to direct me in any way, that would be wonderful. Okay. Meantime, everybody's happy. Everybody agrees. I'm trying to say something controversial to provoke some excitement here, but I think so far I'm in the safe zone. Okay. But comments are always welcome, of course. Okay, so what's the big tragedy that happens on the eighth day? The big tragedy is that the Torah talks about how they offered all the offerings that were commanded, and afterward there was the blessing, as we discussed on Tuesday, and then fire comes forth before. You know what? Let's open it. Let's open it up just to make sure I'm getting this right. I don't want to misquote. Here. Okay, the eighth day. Okay, so verse 23, Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. They came out and blessed the people, and the glory of God appeared to all the people. So usually that means, doesn't say the word tent, cloud, usually means the cloud rests on the tabernacle. That's a sort of a symbol of a divine presence. Then comes the tragedy. Well, the verse 24 is still beautiful. Fire went forth from before God and consumed the ascent offering and the fats upon the altar. All the people saw, sang praises, and fell upon their faces. So that's the expression, Vatetza Eish, fire went forth. Okay, new chapter. Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took a fire pan, put coals of fire on it, placed incense upon the fire, and thus brought before God a fire that was foreign, inasmuch as he had not commanded them. So they're super excited. What do you do when you're excited? You go into the temple, the innermost chamber, because you're seeking closeness, you're seeking intimacy, you're seeking closeness. Now, later we know that Aaron is going to be commanded never go into the Holy of Holies unless it's Yom Kippur and unless it's done with a prescribed service. And even then, it's only one person representing everybody else, meaning Aaron. But nobody, you can't just run in there. And Aaron's sons offer foreign fire, foreign incense, and which they were not commanded. And then the tragedy happens. Number two, fire went forth from before God and consumed them, and they died before God. So, how do you think about this episode? And I guess you would say, on the surface, you can call it a sin. It is a sin, Chet ben Aaron, the sin of the sons of Aaron. And what is it? Why did this happen, and why does it happen then? So there's two ways to look at this. One way to look at it is they're just doing their own thing. So part of service of God is having not only love, but also awe. So you can't just because someone brings you into their life, you can't just sort of push yourself in to that person, to that person's space where they're not comfortable, even if it's coming out of love, and that's the sin. And the sages also, various sages offer different interpretations to say why were they killed? And most people are not satisfied with saying it's just that they brought the foreign fire. People are looking for more, and therefore the Medrash has all different interpretations. The Talmud has all different interpretations. We'll see what they have in common in a minute or two. Um, here's an example. Here's an example. Look at Rashi. Fire went forth. Rabbi Eliezer says, the sons of Aaron died only because they decided in matter of halacha to offer up incense in the presence of their teacher, who was Moses. So that's one interpretation. In a moment, I'll try to show what they're trying to do here. Rabbi Ishmael says they died because they entered the sanctuary after drinking wine. You may know that this is so. What is the proof? Because this verse doesn't say anything about drinking wine. But Rabbi Ishmael says the sin was not so much offering the incense, but coming in drunk. How do you know this? You may know that this is so. For after their death, God warned those remaining not to enter the sanctuary after drinking wine. In other words, what happens right after the story? Not in this parsha, but later. In response to this parsha, it says, after the death of the two sons of Aaron, actually it is in this parsha. Let's find it. No, it's not in this parsha, but it is in Acharei. There's a parsha called Acharei. In 2 weeks from now, we're going to read Acharei Mot, after the death, after the passing of the two sons of Aaron. And there, amongst other things, it says not to drink wine. So what does Rashi say? What does Rashi quotes Rabbi Yishmael? What does Rabbi Yishmael say? The reason why, if the Torah says don't drink wine in response to the story, that's an indication that they drank wine, and that's the sin. But what do we see? And there are many other interpretations. Some say they died because they didn't want to marry. Some say they died because they didn't want to have children. But what you see, all these rabbinic commentators, what they're all trying to say here is people are not satisfied to say that it's just the fact that they brought incense, because if they just brought incense, even though it's not a nice thing, even though it's not right, it wasn't sanctioned. But why was the punishment so severe? So that question of why is the punishment so severe leads the commentators to look for other reasons for the punishment. And they're looking for sins that are not necessarily mentioned explicitly, but they're alluded to. So for example, the first person says, it's not that you brought incense, it's that you brought incense without asking Moshe, without asking your teacher. And this becomes sort of a prototype for issuing halachic rulings in the presence of your teacher. So that's undermining the teacher, which is basically undermining the chain of tradition. That's the severity. That's the first opinion. Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yishmael says no. Rabbi Yishmael says it's a sin against God. It's not a sin against Moses, and that is they came in drunk. So it's not so much the incense, but we're looking for something peripheral. And the reason why we're looking for that is because we have this problem of why could they be punished so severely? So that is on the surface level of the story. Then you get more the spiritual and the mystical readings. And the mystical readings say as follows. This is a sin, but it's not really a punishment. Why? The problem with the sons of Aaron, and this is their sin, the problem with the sons of Aaron is that they want the soul to expire from the body. If you told them, don't go into the temple because you may get killed, they would not mind, because they feel such an intense love to holiness, to transcendence. They feel intense love to God that they don't want to be on this earth. They want to escape. And the Kabbalah refers to it as running. They want to run, but they don't want to return. And if you think about it this way, in some ways that's intoxication. What is drinking? Drinking is they're escaping the rational mind. And if you look at the other commentaries that Rashi doesn't quote, but other Midrashim quote, they didn't want to marry, they didn't want to have children. What does that mean? It means they don't want to live a civilized life. They don't want to live in this earth. They want to escape. And that's why, on one hand, it's a sin. It's a sin because it's against God's will, because God wants us to be on this earth. But on the other hand, it's a sin that the Torah does enough to indicate that the sin was actually, it's a spiritual sin. It's a sin that comes from a yearning for spirituality. And you could see this in various places, but one place that you could see it is that this, we see it in multiple places, but one place is the same expression that's used to show, to represent God's presence in the temple, which is the Vateitze Eish, fire went forth from before God. That same expression is used to the fire that kills the sons of Aaron. Fire went forth from before God. Same exact expression. Fire went forth from before God. In verse 24, what are we talking about? We're talking about the greatest divine revelation. In verse 2, what are we talking about? The quote unquote punishment for the sin of the death of Aaron, for the sin of the sons of Aaron. So, but why use the same expression and why use a positive expression? So one interpretation is that it's indicating this is a result. Their sin is not coming from, it's a, I don't want to say bad place because it's bad because the definition of bad is inconsistent with God's will. So it's funny that the word Eish Zerah, foreign fire, in Torah literature, idol worship is avodah zarah, foreign service. Foreign doesn't mean so terrible. So we have the same term, foreign service for idol worship and foreign incense. But foreign means it doesn't really matter how foreign you are. Foreign means you're off the path. It's zar, it doesn't belong here. So it's a sin because it's inconsistent with God's will, because God wants you to be on earth. But on the other hand, it's a sin that expresses a intensely spiritual experience. And it's no surprise that it happens exactly when it happens. Because when is the love for God felt more intensely? More than when the temple was built and the climax of the last couple of months has occurred, and now God's presence is amongst the people. So if you're spiritually sensitive, you're drawn to that to the extreme. Now, the challenge is not to be number 8, which is be transcendent but connected to the 7. Don't merge into the oneness completely, because even though maybe that's what you want to do, but that's not what God wants you to do. So all I'm trying to say is this story, what the Kabbalah refers to it as running without returning, ratso without shov. You're running without returning. You're yearning, but you're not being anchored. It's a very important lesson in general, but and you'll also see it actually. You'll see it in the book of many of the laws in the book of Leviticus, which on the surface are very technical and very ritualistic, and many of them do not have logical explanations because the laws of purity and impurity, which is a chok, which is a decree. Nevertheless, the Kabbalists see many of those laws as a way and as a way of maintaining this idea of running and returning. So it's a very important theme in the Torah, especially in the 3rd book. But it's no surprise that this episode happens exactly today and exactly at this moment of the story. Because the challenge is, could you be 8? 8 is transcendent but connected to the 7. So in the language last week, could you be in the sea but on the dry land, not drowning in the sea and not dead in the sea? So that's what we're dealing with. That's one very important issue. And then we'll try to show how this plays out in other ways as well. Go ahead, Vicky, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. So based on all the interpretations, especially the spiritual, the sons of Aaron actually didn't mind to be
right.
close to Hashem, right? So
right.
Is there any interpretation that there could be punishment for Aaron because he didn't want them to die, obviously, and maybe it's somehow connected to him participating in the sin of the golden calf?
Yes, there is a medrash. I don't want to go into that right now because I don't have all the information in front of me, but there is a medrash that it says that when Moshe retells the story of the Exodus, when Moshe retells the story of the book of the golden calf in the book of Exodus, in the book of Deuteronomy, so it says that God was angered with Aaron, Moshe says, to destroy him, but I prayed for Aaron. And I forget what's the word that causes this interpretation, that triggers this interpretation, but Rashi quotes the Medrash that says that it helped, Moshe's prayer helps partially, and it doesn't help, and only partially, because you see that Aaron's sons die. So the commentaries are connecting the death of the sons of Aaron, as far as Aaron is concerned, it's a punishment for Aaron, yes.
Thank you.
But what exactly that means and how it connects to the spiritual story, we have to think about that, because I would say Aaron is the opposite. In general, Aaron is the man of peace, and Aaron, more than Moshe, is the one who connects the teachings to the people. So somehow or another, the transcendence is a problem, trying to escape. But on the other hand, to bring it down and anchor it has its own challenges, and that's the challenge of, if you're too connected to the bottom, you may end up with a golden calf, right? So it's two sides of the same coin, but managing this balance of being connected in the transcendent and rooted in the transcendent, and together with that, be living on this earth. The failure can happen in two ways. The failure means you're too transcendent, and the other failure is that you're too accommodating to the demands of the world, right? So it could be that both these failures, so to speak, comes from the same point, which is the understandable inability. In other words, we understand, I'm not blaming anybody. It's a very big challenge. The demand is high to get this right. At any point you want two extremes to come together, it's very difficult to maintain the balance. When you have extremes coming together, according to the Kabbalah, when two extremes come together, when two opposites or different things come together, you need something overarching, because naturally these things are going to pull apart. You need something greater holding them together. So when you're going to see these two opposites coming together, it's an indication that something greater is happening. One example would be marriage. You have man and woman, they're completely different. And one way to think about this is you need something overarching. There's all kinds of teachings that teach that, but even the symbolism of the chuppah. The chuppah is, there has to be something overarching to keep these two, I don't want to say opposite, but different beings together, because naturally it's also an absurdity to put a man and a woman together and try to create a union. It's an absurdity. But part of that, so you need something greater, you need something overarching to keep this together. And so what I'm trying to say is that if these things do not come together, understandably so, it can go wrong in two ways. It can go wrong where people are becoming too spiritual or becoming too grounded in the physical. So the sons of Aaron is one, and then Aaron making the golden calf is the other.
Right, because Aaron actually, he's in 8, but he's also in 1 because he needs to continue living.
Right.
And he needs to
I want
continue.
to say that 8 is living, because 8 is related to 7. Oneness means you could lose yourself in the oneness. You could lose yourself in the oneness. The oneness means there's nothing else. And in truth, there is nothing else, because we talked about this last time when we spoke, that one as opposed to singular is that it's also a paradox. In other words, one is also the paradox where many things could become part of a oneness. Singularity, that doesn't work as easy. Maybe you can argue that it's become one single entity, but it's not truly one. There's two. In other words, you could have a one that is composed of different details, right? You could have a 1,000-piece puzzle and you have one puzzle, right? That could be done. But you can't say I have a single. I mean, maybe you could say it, but single doesn't bring out that point as well. So oneness also has the paradox, because oneness doesn't necessarily negate different things coming together. But with 8, it's built into the equation, right? 8 is, you have to have 7 to have 8.
So it's 8 is a 1 on a different level, right?
Correct. In the language of the Kabbalah, 8 is the 1 riding on the 7, because you hear that. I may have mentioned on Tuesday that there's this expression that you see, for example, when the Jews crossed the sea. It's Az Yashir Moshe. Then Moshe will sing. So the word Az, and then Az appears in Moshe's life in multiple times. When Moshe was in Egypt and he complained to God, how come when he went to Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh increased the burden of the slavery, Moshe returns to God and is very upset, and he says, Me'az, from when I came. And the Medrash connects these two. Me'az, that Az Yashir, Moshe sings the song, he's responding to the previous time he said Az, then. from when, from then, same word in Hebrew. But in any case, there's a lot of az around Moshe, and the commentaries say, what is az? Az is Aleph Zayin, 1 and 7. 1 and 7 equals 8. What is 8? 8 is the 1 and the 7. But if you don't have the 1 and the 7, you don't have 8. But the point is, it's easier said than done. That is the challenge of life. Challenge of life is to understand that there's something greater, to be above and yet be within. And that's a very tricky thing, especially when you feel close to God, or when you're having a spiritual experience, like the Jewish people have in the third book of the Torah, which is the book of intimacy and closeness. If you think about it, the next book of the Torah, let's want to break this thing down. Book one is the family of the patriarchs and matriarchs. Book 2 is the nation of Israel. Book 5 is the repetition. So let's put that aside. You're left with book 3 and 4. What is the difference between book 3 and 4 in the Torah? Book 3 is the opening statement, and the entire story happens the entire book happens in the tent of meeting. God calls Moshe from the tent of meeting. It's all about the inauguration of the tent of meeting and what happens to the people and the laws communicated in the tent of meeting. What's book 4? Book 4 is the journey, Bamidbar in the desert. Numbers is really in Hebrew called Bamidbar in the desert, when the Jewish people are traveling and all the difficulties and tribulations that happen on the road. So in other words, a Jew, there's two states where you can be. You can be in your home and outside. In your home means in your environment, that's book 3. And book 4 is when you're challenged in the outside world. So each of these states of being spiritually home and spiritually grounded, or being in the road outside in the outside world, each presents a challenge to the 7, to the model of 8. But the point here is, for what we're saying is that when you're home with God and you are in your own space and you're a spiritual seeker, then the challenge to the 8 is, number one challenge is, don't be like the sons of Aaron. You have to run, but you have to return. So that's that, and then later we'll talk about the other side. Don't get too pulled into the world, because a lot of that happens in the 4th book, and this theme, if you want to look at, it's a certain themes that reoccur in the Hasidic commentaries of the Torah. This theme almost, I want to say every story, but a lot of the stories of the Torah that are going to happen in book 3 and book 4, the background of the story is trying to get this balance done. For example, the spies. Everybody knows this issue of the spies would be that, from the Hasidic perspective, they don't want to go into Israel. They'd rather stay in the desert. Why would they want to stay in the desert? Because they don't want to. They feel that going into the physical world and investing so much time in agriculture will pull them away from spirituality. So that you could not get the balance right of being able to be a farmer, working the land, and yet be a spiritual people. And that tension plays out also with the story of Korach. We don't want to get it. We don't want to keep going, because really so many episodes in the 3rd and 4th book of the Torah could be about, can you have what the Kabbalah would call running and returning, or what we're going to call number 8, which is 1 riding on the 7. If you have 7 and you don't have 1, and you have 1, you don't have 7, there's a problem. Now 7 is also okay, because 7 is the complete cycle of the world, and you have Shabbat and everything is fine. But could you get to but then you're not touching transcendence. Transcendence is beyond that. And then the thing is, could you also bring that back? So I'm going to try to we'll take Ben's question and then try to do one more episode from the Haftorah to bring it in and tie it all together and see maybe there's an application in our life as well. Go ahead. Well, of course there is. Of course there is. I'll stop right here. Of course there is. We have to do this every day. We say the Shema. Okay, what do you do when you say the Shema? God is one. What do? You cover your eyes. Why do you cover your eyes? Because you don't want to be distracted by the stimuli of the visual world. You want to say, I want to block everything out. In a way, it's an escape. Is that escape healthy? It's critical. Because but on the other hand, you can't walk around your whole day covering your eyes. Not only because you're going to crash into the nearest pole, but because that's not the point. The point is run. Run means transcend. One says, in a way, you're saying, what I really, really want is connection to God. That's the only thing that matters to me when my eyes are covered. And then the point is, can I take that inspiration, that feeling, and uncover my eyes and see the world as it is? And with that perspective, live my life on earth. And then the goal is not to escape, but to sanctify. Okay, so that's a whole different story. But we're going through that model every day. In a way, you start your day with something spiritual. No, Danny, you say Shema, you cover, but even with covering the eyes, it's actually visual, right? You're actually blocking. You're saying, I don't want to think about all of this. You're running. But on the other hand, you have to return. And now, if you didn't return, if you didn't run, there's a linguistic issue here. If you didn't run, you're not returning. Returning means you're returning back from somewhere. So you say, oh, you know what, today I'm not going to run. I'll just return. No, 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 no. If you didn't run, then we say, be careful. Don't run. The sons of Aaron ran, and they didn't return. So the lesson is we have to make sure to run and return. But if I don't run, I'm not returning. I have no part of the equation because return means return from somewhere. Return means return from a spiritual experience. But if I say, you know what, today I'm just not going to think about this idea of transcendence, of spirituality, of trying to elevate myself higher than the physical stimuli of the world, then it's wonderful, but I didn't return, right? It's not that I have the second half I returned. No, I didn't. I don't have any because return means run and return. Return means come back from somewhere. So that's a side point. Go ahead, Ben, please.
Actually, now I have two questions, but I'll throw them out at once.
Okay.
So the first one is, so when someone is dying, or when you're in a situation where I've seen it with the hostages or whatever, where they think they're going to be killed, they oftentimes say the Shema, and that is something that, because I assume that the thought is, I'm not returning. I'm going to return to the one. I'm about to return to the oneness of the world and oneness of God as I pass on. So that was question one for you. Is that right, or is there another interpretation of that? And then second was, I remember there was someone before Noah, or maybe just after Noah, who went up to a mountain and said, I only want to be spiritual, and
Yeah.
I don't want to, I just want to be one with God. And like a Buddhist, you sit on top of a mountain, and God said, oh, you don't want to be spiritual? You don't want to return? Fine, you're done. And because that's not what you're here for. So those are two questions together.
Right. Okay, so let's start with the second one. The second one, the verse says, it doesn't say so explicitly. It says, if you look at this, the Genesis chapter, I believe it's 5. So it talks about that there was a man, Chanoch, and I don't know how they translate it in English, Enoch, whatever they say, but in Hebrew it's Chanoch. Chanoch walked with God, and he's gone because God took him. So it's not exactly clear what that means, right? So there's different interpretations. One interpretation is this exact point, that he walked with God, he didn't walk with people, because at that point, the society was corrupt. And his solution was to escape. And that's also a sin. God takes him. So in very similar terms as what happens to the sons of Aaron. Right. But there we get much less drama, because there, I would say the challenge here is greater. The allure here is greater, because we are introducing the transcendent. There, it's almost like he's running away because the people are not moral, right? So he's sort of fed up with society. Here it's you're getting a taste. You've got, in a way, if you're spiritually sensitive, God is asking you something very, very tricky. Taste the transcendence. Have a desire to escape, but then return. Right? It's not just stay here. It's no, you should want to leave and then come back. So that's the first one. Second point is throughout Jewish history, not just unfortunately, tragically in the last year and a half, but throughout Jewish history, Jewish people, if they were dying or killed, they would say the Shema, and that's a declaration of the oneness of God. And it's almost like at the moment of truth, what is important? What is reality? And the reality for us is Hashem is one. That's the reality. And unfortunately, at the end of one's life, you're going into you're connecting to the transcendence of God. Hopefully, we do that every day. Hopefully, every day we declare what is meaningful and what is important and what is reality for us. But the difference is then we also go to work, and then we also eat lunch, and we also go to the gym. In other words, then we are touching that transcendence, but we have the opportunity to sanctify the creation, which is ultimately the purpose of creation from the perspective of Kabbalah and Hasidism. So we have the opportunity to do God's will. But how does the soul feel about this? It's mixed message, because for the soul in the soul in the physical world is in a confined space. But on the other hand, it knows this is the will of God. So there's different ways of how the sages formulate this idea. One, they do so very concisely in the book of in the Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Father. So it talks about you're born against your will. So one of the things it says there is al karcha chatacha, you live against your will, and you're born again, and you die against your will. You're born against your will, you live against your will, you die against your will, meaning al karcha, you're forced. God doesn't ask you, right? God doesn't say, oh, do you want to be born? And God doesn't say, do you want to die? It's against your will. But one of the things it says also, you live against your will. So so from the perspective of Hasidism, this touches the concept that if you ask the soul, what do you want to do? Do you want to live or do you want to die? So both are against its will. It wants to do both. Naturally, it wants to be in heaven, but it wants to be here because it's the will of God. So it's almost like the paradox is built into what the soul wants. So it's again, you live against your will, you die against your will. Because what do you want is, in a way, you're torn. Your soul wants the transcendence, but the soul wants to do what God's will, which is to be here. So, for example, if you have someone who you really, really love and you want to be with them all day, but they say, do me a favor, go do something for me, go to work or go here, go there. And then you're going away and it seems like you're distancing yourself. So on the surface, you say, oh, I'm very far from my beloved. I wish I could be closer. But in a way, if you would be close, you wouldn't be close because you're not doing what they want. So by being far, you're being close, you know? So that's what's happening here. What the soul would rather be with its beloved, which is embraced by the transcendent light of God. But because it's in love with God, it wants to do what God wants. So it wants to descend to the physical world. So it's in a state, there's this built-in tension, which is expressed with this notion of running and returning. And it's the pulse of life, right? All of life is the pulse of life. The heart pulses, life pulses. The pulse represents going back and going forth, the bloodstream from the heart. You're going outward, you're coming back. So that pulse of life is true in this physical sense, but it's true in the spiritual sense as well. Okay, so that's a little bit about the running and returning. Now, if you want to turn to the story of the Haftarah, what's the story of the Haftarah? So the Haftarah is the section of the prophets that we read every Shabbat, and it's somehow related to the theme of the Parsha. So when you talk about the theme of the Parsha is the inauguration of a temple. So what do we read about in the Haftarah? We read about King David, who selects the site of Jerusalem for the house of God, for the temple. He did not build the temple. It was his son Solomon who builds the temple. That's another story. God says that David's a man of war, so David can't build the temple, so Solomon will build the temple. So the Haftarah describes how King David decides to bring the ark, which is in some ways it's the most important feature of the temple, the ark itself, and to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. And they have this great ceremony where they come and they bring the ark, and it describes how the great joy of the people experienced. So in some ways, it mirrors the story of the Parsha, because the Parsha is they build a home for God in the desert, and this is they're bringing the ark to Jerusalem, which ultimately that will be the home for the ark. That's one That's one parallel. Another parallel, also, the tragedy strikes, just like the tragedy strikes in the day of the inauguration of the temple. Is also tragedy on that great day when they brought the ark to Jerusalem. And there is a close friend of David. His name was Uzzah, a very righteous man, but it's not exactly clear what he does, but he touches the ark in a way that's not appropriate, and he's killed. So he dies as well. So there's a death on that day too. So there's a lot going on, a lot of parallels. We want to think about is the end of the story. What's the end of the story? The end of the story is that King David, who's the king, and of course part of the king's responsibility is to maintain the dignity of the throne. And there are many laws how the king has to self-respect so people can honor him. So the king can't do business in front of other people. He can't shower in front of other people. He can't take a haircut in front of other people. And here the King David is dancing in the streets like a simple person before the ark. And there's a very powerful exchange between King David and his wife. Who is his wife? His wife is the daughter of King Saul. King Saul is the king that reigned before David, and God first initially selected Saul, but then the kingdom was taken away from Saul and then given to David. Why was it taken away? Amongst other reasons, because King Saul is not loyal to the will of God when it comes to the battle of Amalek, etc. So let's look at this exchange and let's see what this has to do with 8 and how this talks about the idea of going beyond nature and connecting that to the way you live your life. So let's see what happens. Verse, so I'm going to try to read at least from 13 maybe till oh, it's not here. It's not. I think I'm going to have to look at the actual book of prophets, not here, because here it doesn't have the whole story. Samuel 2, chapter 6. Okay, let's see if we can find it. Samuel 2. Whoops, no. Okay, beautiful story. What a great story. Okay, here we go. So they bring the ark to the Jerusalem. So I'm going to read a few words. Verse 13. And it was when the bearers of the ark of God had trodden 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. So this is fascinating. As they walk every 6 paces, they're offering another offering. And David danced with all his might before the Lord. And David was girdled with a linen ephod. Ephod is like an apron. And David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting, with shouting, and with the sound of the shofar. Shouting, I don't know if that's a great interpretation. Truah is one of the sounds of the shofar, so it's truah is also a sound of shofar. Okay. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, who's the wife of David, peered through the window, and she saw the King David hopping and dancing before the Lord. And she loathed him in her heart. The word loathed him, batives, it was disrespectful. She felt like he's not maintaining his dignity. So they bring the ark to the house of God, etc., etc. And David go. So they finish the celebration, and everybody goes home, and all the people departed, everyone to his home. Now look at verse 20 and 21 and 22. So it's actually very sad. 23 is sad. But now we talk about the exchange between King David when he gets home and his wife, who's completely upset at him, or the word we used was vatives. She loathed him in her heart. She was upset that he's not maintaining the dignity of the throne. So let's see the conversation. And David returned to bless his household. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David. And she said, how honored was today the king of Israel, who exposed himself today in the eyes of the handmaids of his servants, as would expose himself one of the idlers. Basically, you're acting like an idler, like someone who's empty. Breakim is empty. You do nothing. So here you're the king, and you're dancing before the Lord, but you're dancing like someone who's empty, who's an idler, who has no dignity or self-respect. So that's the rebuke that she gives him. What does he respond? He responds in a very harsh way. So I'm not recommend this. Don't try this at home. But the theme that he says is very, very powerful, I think. So what does he say? King David says, now it looks like he's just taking stabs at her father's home, but there's a deeper meaning here. Verse 21, and David said unto Michal, before the Lord, who chose me above your father and above all his house, to appoint me prince over the people of the Lord, over Israel, therefore I have made merry before the Lord. So she's saying, you're dancing before the maidservants. You're dancing and ridiculing yourself before the simple people. So what does King David say? He says, no, I'm dancing before Hashem, before God, who chose me over your father's home. And he continues, and if I be demeaned more than this, and be abashed in my own eyes, yet of the maidservants of which you have spoken, with them I will get my honor. He says, even if I'm going to be more ashamed, if it's before God, I'd be totally happy to be together with the maidservants that you mentioned, because before God, the king and the maidservants are the same. So that's the exchange, which is a little bit painful, because especially the fact that he is alluding to the fact that her father's home was rejected and David was chosen. So let's try to unpack this for a second. In the meantime, Dr. Tamarin, please go ahead.
Rabbi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My question is this. Why couldn't he have done this dance in private? Why, if it's just between him and God, did he have to make a public spectacle of himself?
So that's what you're in good company. That's what Michal, the daughter of Saul, says. He says, you're the king. You have to maintain your dignity. And he's saying, because there's a parade for God, we're bringing the ark, and there's a celebration for God. So before God, the king should not maintain his own dignity. The king is like everybody else. And the joy has to overtake the king to the extent that you dance. What's the difference between being joyous and dancing? When you dance, it's because the joy doesn't let you sit in your seat. You have to jump up. You have to dance.
Well, now, where do I have the notion that he danced with no clothes on?
I don't think that's the case. She says,
okay.
maybe the translation here, he says, as would expose himself, but it means, ki galot means revealed himself.
Okay, so he wasn't naked.
No, it just means that you're not, a king has to maintain decorum. And if you're just dancing, you're just revealing something that's more of your private life, of your private self, that your own. It's not something you do in public, right? Right. If you're a king, right. So that's the exchange, and we want to get to what's the root of this exchange and how does this tie into the eighth day? And we have a few minutes left, so I think we can do it. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, just a quick question. I was reading the Haftorah from the Chumash, and it says that she didn't have any children. Was it somehow connected?
That's the last verse. That's the last verse. You want to read
Was
it?
it somehow? Yeah, was it somehow connected to her not being able to get the concept?
Maybe. I don't want to. I wasn't thinking about this, but let's see if Rashi says anything. Yeah, from that. Oh, Rashi says actually, Rashi mitigates that. I guess Michal did have children, but the verse says, and Michal, the daughter of Shaul, had no child until the day of her death. But I think that we know she did have a child, so Rashi modifies that and says, from that day on.
Right.
So
that's what.
Yeah. So that's what. Yeah. So obviously, the way the concluding of the story in verse 23 is rebuke of Michal. Okay, so what's happening here? What's really happening here? So King David, when he responds to her, he basically says, I was chosen. He could have said, look at verse 21. And David said unto Michal, before the Lord who chose me, that's it, who chose me. Beautiful. But he continues and says, above your father and above all his household. These words, above your father and above all his household, are words that he didn't have to say. He could have just said, before the Lord who chose me to appoint me prince over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore, I have made merry before the Lord. So that represents that this tension and this disagreement between Michal and his wife, between Michal and King David and his wife Michal, is really a dispute between the vision of a king on the side of David, the house of David versus the house of Saul. So the same reason why Saul was rejected and David was chosen, that's what leads David to dance. And there's all kinds of reasons of doing this. And so what's Saul's real sin? So Saul didn't want to kill all the sheep of Amalek when God told him to. What's the real sin? The real sin is the real sin from the Kabbalistic perspective is Saul serves God in a logical way. And logical way means I do what makes sense. And what that means is if the Samuel tells me something that doesn't make sense to me, I'm not going to do it. So then he loses the kingship. But it also means that I would never consider dancing before the Lord with such intensity that I go beyond the role of the king and I do things that are beyond what a person would do on a regular day, what a king would do on a regular day. In other words, I'm very calculated and I'm very measured, and I'm very logical. And in that sense, in some ways, that's what kings should do. But King David says, ultimately, God rejected that. Because what does God want? What does God want? And what's the role of a leader? To show the people how, when it comes to service of God, the devotion has to be beyond the self. It's not like, oh, I'm maintaining my position of dignity in the community, and this is not considered respectful, so I'm not going to dance. No, if it's before God, the love to God, the devotion, the joy has to overtake you. And the relationship with God and the relationship with others has to go beyond just the logical. So in some ways, the Haftarah is touching upon the logical is like the natural, and the going beyond logical would be number 8. And you have to be able, especially if you're a king, you have to be able to go beyond the number 7 and the number 8. And the more influence you have, and the more of a position of power you have, the more you have to be able to say, my commitment to God is not only logical, but there's something greater than me. And before God, I dance like everybody else. But this ties into the broader point of, are we serving God only with logic, or are we serving God with ecstasy, which is beyond logic? And that ecstasy is going to cause me to dance. And dancing is not a rational thing. If you landed from Mars and you see people dancing, it's a strange activity. A lot of the activities we do make sense. You're eating because you're hungry, biological need, I understand. You want to be happy, be happy. But all of a sudden, because you're happy, you're swaying your hands and moving your feet. It's not a logical thing, but it represents the idea that we are doing things that are not. We can't sit straight. We are involved in something greater than self with the dance, and especially if you're dancing in a very curated dance, a very organized dance. That's not King David. The King David, Mephazes and Mecharkar, he's just jumping around like a lunatic. Okay, so that's not what a king should do. But before God, there are times where that level of commitment and that level of ecstasy is critical. I would say even for a king, but maybe even especially for a king. So this scene of King David dancing, when someone's dancing means I'm invested here completely. It's not just a logical exercise for me. It's much more than that. Like we learn Torah all year, but on Simchat Torah, we dance with the Torah. And everybody says, what are you dancing with the Torah? If you're so happy that God gave you the Torah, open up the book and read the book. What are you dancing? And by the way, Jewish people, as far as I know, are the only culture that when a book falls onto the floor, they get up and they kiss it. Why are you kissing a book? You want a book, you read the book, right? Why are you kissing a book? So the point here is that our relationship with the Torah, our relationship with ideas, it's not just logical, it's logical also, but it goes beyond that as well. And that's the scene, and that's the imagery of David dancing. And Michal cannot understand it because that's not the model she had in her father's home. Saul was much more calculated and much more logical, and that was his downfall ultimately. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
Right. I'm reminded, as you talk about King David, of what they call the Jerusalem phenomenon. And when I was in Jerusalem, I was called in to see a prominent British cardiologist who was having what I experienced as a manic episode in which he had this ecstatic relationship with God. But the point is, he frankly was being bordering on psychotic. And I suggest that he go back to the UK because he had lost control. So what's the fine line between—
So the fine line, that's an excellent point. That's the running and returning. You have to run, you have to return. And for King David, he didn't do that every day of his career. He did it once when the highlight of his career, when they brought the ark to the city of David, right? That's a one-time event. Once a year, you're Simchat Torah. If you dance like you dance on Simchat Torah every day, then there's obviously
So what you're saying, Rabbi, is he was ecstatic, but he could come back.
That's right.
And this person who I saw who was manic couldn't
Yes.
come back, and therefore had to send him back to England to get on medication.
That's right, and that's why if you look at what, in some ways, the most beautiful statement is of the story. I love this. And David returned to bless his household. Now, his household is, he's coming back, he's dancing. It's the most spiritual time of his career. And what does he go? He goes home, right? He goes home to his family.
By the way, Rabbi, an example of this is performers, rock stars, who have this ecstatic experience on the stage, but then it's very hard for them to come down Therefore,
Very
they have to take downers in order to fall asleep, like Michael Jackson, because part of the issue is they have this ecstasy when they're on the stage, and then they can't come back so fast.
And then you go home and your wife tells you take out the garbage. And you're like, I don't take out the garbage. I'm the celebrity, right?
Exactly.
But King David is able to experience this tremendous ecstasy dancing. And then he comes, and then what does he want to do? He goes home to bless his home. He's to bless his home. He wants to his household. He wants to speak to his wife. He wants to speak to his children.
Well,
right?
you know, what's fascinating then about it is this, that most people, when they're ecstatic, it is about themselves. And what
Right.
you're saying was that King David's ecstasy was not about himself, it was about God.
Right. And that's beautiful. And that's why.
Because in all fairness, people who are manic are invested in themselves and they're thinking about their pleasure. They're really not thinking about others. In other words, if people go out and gamble and lose all their money, or they go out and engage in reckless behavior, they're really thinking about themselves.
Right. That's very powerful, and that ties in. It's beyond the scope of you can't do it right now for the timing, but the Kabbalah talks about the difference between the person who could come back and cannot come back is really in the approach of how they start running to begin with, right? In other words, not that they diverge on the way down; they diverge on the way up. Why are you looking for ecstasy? Is it for your own selfish purposes, or is it because for the will of God, or to be devoted to others? So that's very important about what is the underlying feeling of this whole experience. And if you have the proper attitude on the way in, then you could have a proper attitude. Then you'll be able to return. But if the escape is not done properly, then the return will be much more difficult. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, well, thank you, Rabbi. The other quality that David expresses here, and that he thinks highly of other people, because if he's dancing, the other people are also connected to God the way he does, right? And that's what Michal didn't understand.
Right. So he's dancing like and with the maidservants. And Michal is also, if you have a kingdom, if you have a king, you need hierarchy, you need distance. That's how you create honor and respect. And King David is saying that before, yes, that's true, but before God, the barriers, we're equal before God. Even the king and the simple people are all the same before God. So it's connecting you to other people as well. That's beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yes, thank you. Go ahead, Ben, please.
Yeah, apropos of what John just said, though, it is a bit of a narcissistic kind of thing, because he destroyed his home life at the same time. It's not quite as, he came home, he was in ecstasy, and then he threw darts at his wife and his wife's family, which broke, as I understand it, they never had a marital relationship again. So after that, or supposedly. So is it okay? I mean, is everyone is okay with
it's not okay. It's not okay to communicate that way. In other words, they're both of them are speaking very harsh to each other. But that's already another discussion. That's the human side. Sometimes when people speak very harsh, the natural response is to become defensive and reciprocate that. So I'm not condoning that aspect of it, right? So yes, maybe she could have been more sensitive in her critique, and he could have been more sensitive in his response. So yes, so I'm not saying David is perfect, but what I am saying is that the reason why she was triggered this way, and his response is what offended her so much is the exact point where the house of Saul and the house of David diverge. And that's the exact point of why David was chosen over Saul. So it's not just a different taste, it's a different style. Sometimes two spouses, one person likes these curtains and the other person likes the other window shades, and they're fighting over that. And it's really not significant. But the reason why there's so much pain and hurt in this conversation is because it touches on a real deep truth. It touches on a real divergence in the philosophy of life and the philosophy of what is kingdom and what's the way, how do you serve God? Is it primarily intellectual, or are you also leaving room for what is beyond logic? And so my point is, the reason why I'm not saying they should have expressed it this way, but what I am saying is this triggered a real deep pain because it's a real issue. It wasn't they were just fighting about something that was not significant. This touches upon something real. Now, they could have gone to couples therapy and found a better way to discuss this. I agree. But this is not trivial, and it's not but it expresses a real divergence here, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. I mean, it
And
did,
maybe the point is, and
yeah.
maybe the verse 23 that says that they never had a child again, maybe that's not because maybe that's a result of the pain that they inflict on each other. In other words, maybe that's the point of the story, that even though King David is able to get to this point of the ecstasy and understand that before God, he's like anybody else. Maybe the critique is, but you didn't know how to come home properly. Yes, you thought you were coming home and you thought you were going to come home, but did you really communicate properly? So maybe that's the critique. In other words, the critique could be not to the content of what he's saying or what they are saying, but to the form. But all I'm trying to say, it's clear that she was really offended and he was really hurtful. I guess, and if he would hurt her, my guess is he was hurt, right?
Yeah.
He was hurt by the critique. So the point is, there's real pain here because they stumbled upon something real. This is a real philosophical and real. I don't want not just philosophical. This is a real difference in I don't want to say lifestyle. I don't know exactly what the word is, but this is big. This is a big idea. This is not just trivial.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Have a wonderful day, everybody. And
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom. It's right the 8th.
Yeah.
Okay. Be well.